Good afternoon, all. I'm Advocate Carien van Dijk, and it is my absolute pleasure to be presenting this webinar to you today, Surviving a SARS Payroll Audit. I think we're surviving a bit more than just this in these days, but today I will be discussing this in a much more detail. If you'll just look at my comment, and those of you who want to comment, please, it would just give me some insight as to how technical in detail I have to go, or perhaps if I have to go a bit more basic through the slides. But I would just like to know, if you haven't read it yet, whether you have ever been involved in a full SARS payroll audit. So I'm not talking about a simple assessment or anything like that, but an actual SARS payroll audit where you have received the audit from SARS representatives themselves. I see a lot of you have never been involved in payroll audit, so that gives me a very good indication. If you have been involved in one, please drop me a comment. If you are currently in one, that would be even better. But yes, I see most of you have not. Okay, fantastic. So you can keep the comments coming in, and I will in any case continue. If you have any questions, Q&As, I will try to get to them as much as possible. I will go back in history as well. If I maybe miss one or two, just remind me. But I believe that it's always helpful to answer the questions as we go, because otherwise you forget what you want to ask and then it's not that valuable anymore. So please feel free, if I'm on a slide, to quickly drop me a question. And as I say, hopefully if I don't miss it, I'll get to you and we continue from there. Most likely your question is what someone else will also have. Okay, so on with that. So the next slide is just to outline what I'm going to discuss today. So the outline is going to be, first of all, a bit of the basics of an actual audit. So this might sound stupid and a bit more theoretical, but I promise you I'm going to be as practical as possible, as a payroll audit is actually one of my most specialized fields that I do. And it's quite important to know the act, because believe you me, SARS do take chances. And even in a corporate environment, just to give you a bit of background, I was a senior at PwC and then also the senior tax specialist for FirstRand South African. In there, we have seen so many times where they actually submit a scope of audit, and the scope of audit actually differs from what they do after that. So it's quite important to know the rights in terms of the Tax Administration Act, because if you do not know those rights, easily you can actually provide them with something that is not being asked for, and they can use that. And you don't want to be too hardball, obviously, but you don't want to jeopardize yourself or your clients and for something that could have actually been done differently. Now, we're going to discuss that in a bit more detail. Then obviously number two, the scope of audit, which is the most important part of all of this. Then number three, we're going to chat about the SARS questionnaire. I've actually placed in some screenshots of how it looks, and then I'm going to tell you we've been involved in a big universities payroll audit frequently, so we know exactly what SARS is currently looking at. They have in the past they had some kind of hot topics that they're always looking for. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that, because sometimes the hot topics can differ as we continue. Sometimes it's the same. So not everything is kind of always the same or general. It depends on the type of SARS auditor that you actually have. Then number four, interaction with the auditor. That's quite important, because that can most certainly kind of influence the outcome of your actual audit. Then number five, the preparation and delivery methods. This is where most of the risk sits, because in the end, we have seen so many SARS auditors where they will actually raise a negative assessment simply because they didn't understand what was provided to them. It was actually quite shocking, but we have seen this too many times. And then lastly, the payroll audit assessment, what to look for and what to understand. So as you can see, I'm trying to make this as practical as possible so that if you are faced with a payroll audit yourself or on behalf of your client, you will have a very good and general idea of where to start and what to look for. Right. Going on to the first portion, the basics of audit in terms of the Tax Administration Act. Now, the audit life cycle, and I've made it just kind of like a simplified way to explain to you exactly what is the audit life cycle in terms of the Tax Administration Act. Now, first of all, in terms of Section 40 of the Tax Administration Act, SARS does a selection. Now, this can either be random or risk assessment, and which I'm also going to explain in the slides later on, as you can see, but let's just go back here. The risk assessment that I'm talking about here, this is the quite important part. For example, if you have certain clients from whatever, it can be company, it can be sole provider, it really does not matter, but they are registered for payroll. If they do not submit their returns frequently, or if they have frequent late payments, or for example, if they have certain employees that approaches the CCMA and then afterwards raise certain objections with SARS, because as you know, anyone can actually submit a query to SARS in an unknown manner. So if that happens, it actually takes up your risk as a company. So SARS has a risk profile for each and every company from a payroll perspective. And that risk profile determines how many times a year you will be audited. So that's why if someone tells you, you have to be aware of what you're doing here and here because it might affect your risk profile with SARS, it is simply stating that you might get audited every year if you have a higher risk profile, as opposed to once every 5 years, or some I've met companies that have never been audited and they've been open for 10, 20 years. So it really does depend on the risk profile, because usually if your risk profile is quite low, the SARS selection will be at random. But let me also tell you, my current business partner, as you can see, I'm part of the Supremacy Group now. My business partner is an ex-SARS auditor, and she focuses mainly on payroll audits. And from a SARS perspective, the thing that they look at is they build in certain checks when you do certain submissions. So depending on what you submit, they do comparisons. So let me explain. For example, we have certain IT-free returns that certain entities have to submit every 6 months. So, for example, one of those returns have to be submitted by financial service providers like banks or insurance companies, etc. So let's take a bank, for example. Now, every 6 months, each and every bank in South Africa has to submit bank statements as one of the requirements of the IT-free report to SARS. Now, SARS is taking quite a while to process all the information because, as you can imagine, it is a real heap of data. But we have seen that they take about 4 years to process something. So you can be rest assured if something happens, it will take them 4 years to get back and to actually trigger something. But nonetheless, what they can do is they can actually pick up on the bank statements if you make certain payments out of your business bank account to, let's say, a lot of individuals. And usually the trigger is if this happens on a monthly basis. So the problem is that is what is then usually your trigger. Usually we get a lot of clients asking us, oh, but how will SARS ever know? Well, that's one of the ways they know. So they will actually go and look at the bank statements, and out of the bank statements, they will get a certain trigger, for example, frequent payments to X, Y, and Z. and that will actually then be part of the selection process for payroll audit out of the blue.